In this video, we're going to look at the assembly process for the shock assembly. So what I have is I have a folder on my desktop for the shock assembly, and all the parts that are used in the shock assembly are contained in that folder. In looking at page 11-31 in my book, figure 11-44, it shows me exactly how all the parts and pieces of this go together. So I'm going to use that to assemble everything. And part number one is the bracket. That looks like the part that is going to be the main part that I want to use. So that's the one that I'm going to bring in first. So I'll come up here to File and go to New. I want to select an assembly, and I'm just going to call this Chapter 11 Tutorial 1. Okay, since I already have that file created, I'm going to call it 1A. Now, the first thing I need to do is click on the Assemble button, and I'm going to select the bracket. And I'll say Open. Now, once this comes in, it comes in as this purple color. That means that it's not constrained. Now, the very first piece that's brought in has to be fully constrained, or nothing else will ever be constrained. This ball right here represents the degrees of freedom. Everything that's colored in is a degree of freedom that this thing has. So I can rotate it on the y-axis, I can rotate it on the x-axis, I can rotate it on the z-axis, and I can also move it in all three axes. So this is not constrained at all. But for the first piece, I want to change this to default. Now what this does is it automatically lines up the default planes of the part with the default planes of the assembly, and it turns it to this orange color, letting me know that it's now fully constrained. So I can hit the checkbox, and I now have my bracket brought in, and I can see it over here. So the next thing I want to do is I want to bring in the U support, and the U support is going to be lined up in the bracket. So again, I'll click Assemble, U support, Open. Now for this, I need to pick relationships between parts. So the first thing that I know is that this shaft goes through this hole. So I'm going to click the center line of that shaft and the center line of that hole. And it's going to come up as a distance, and it's going to be however far off it comes in. Now I have two options right now. The easiest is to just go ahead and change this distance to 0 by double clicking it and typing 0. So now when I do that, I can see that a lot of my degrees of freedom have gone away. I can only move this thing up and down now, and I can rotate it. So at this point, I'm ready to place my next constraint. I want this surface to touch this surface. So if I left click right here and then left click right here, it makes those two surfaces coincident, and now I have those two pieces put together. Now in some cases this may automatically turn orange. On the placement tab, if allow assumptions is turned on, then that's what happens. I don't seem to have that turned on right now, so I'm going to need at least one more constraint to get this to be fully constrained. If yours is already orange at this point, just go ahead and accept it and move on to the next piece. If it's not, then what you'll need to do is click on New Constraint, and instead of it being automatic, I'm going to do an angle offset. And I'll select this face and this face. And my angle offset in this case is going to be 0. So now this is orange, and I can go ahead and move on from there, and it tells me right here that it's fully constrained. So I can hit my checkbox. So now I have two of my parts placed into the assembly. I can now move on, and I know that I have a washer and I have a self-locking nut on the bottom of this piece. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the washer. So I'll click Assemble, click Washer, and say Open. And here it is. And the washer is really difficult to grab the center line because it's such a small part. So to make it a little bit easier, I'm going to grab this center, and then I'm going to come over here and try to get the center of the washer. If I'm unable to get the center of the washer, then I'm just going to try to pick a circular reference. So because I picked the circular reference, it kind of goes sort of where it needs to be, but I don't like the placement because that's not going to do well for me. So I'm going to cancel this and start this particular part over again. If you're having a problem putting it apart, don't try to fix it if you've made some mistakes. Just go ahead and start that piece over. So assemble, washer, open. Now to make life a little bit easier, I'm going to click on this button right here, which is show components in a separate window while specifying constraints. What that does is that brings up another window for me that I can zoom in on without zooming in on my overall part. Now by doing that, I can clearly see the center line there and there. Now this came in normal. Normal means perpendicular, but I want them to be coincident, so I just click the drop down and select coincident. Now I can come in here and I can grab the top surface of my washer, and I may have to try a couple of times to actually get that surface, zooming in and around. There it is. Left click that top surface and then left click the bottom of this face. And for some reason there it is. You just got to keep moving your mouse around until it comes in. So now that one's lined up exactly where it's supposed to be. It's turned orange. That means it's fully constrained. I can hit my checkbox. Now that I've got the washer in place, I want to go ahead and put in the self-locking nut. So I'll go to assemble, select the self-locking nut, say open. And again, I'm going to go with the center line to the center line. And I notice that's going the wrong way. That's not the way that I want it to go. But as I keep constraining this, it'll actually get me to the point where I need it to be. I accidentally placed this automatic constraint, so I need to delete it before I go any further. And under placement, I'm going to do a new constraint. So for this new constraint, again, I'm going to do I can do a distance or I can do automatic, but I want to select this bottom face and then this face, and we can see that it made it a distance and it's the wrong way. So I want to change the distance to 0 and then flip it. Once I do that, it's now in the correct place except for the thickness of this washer. So to fix that, there's two different ways I can do it. I can put in the offset distance for the washer, which in this case is 10, and that's probably the easiest way to do it. Or I could have deleted that constraint and used the face of the washer instead of this face. Either way is perfectly fine, but now that it's orange, I'm good to go for this particular piece, so I can hit the checkbox. So now I've got the whole bottom of this thing assembled, and what I have left to do is the top part, which is going to all be in here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to bring in part number 3, which is going to be the pivot. And if I look, the pivot in this particular instance is 250 millimeters thick, and the distance in my bracket is 300. So the internal distance from this side to this side is 300, and the width of my pivot is exactly 250. So if we take our 300 minus our 250, we get an offset distance of 25. And that's going to be important to note here in a second. So I'll go to assemble, I'll select the pivot, and open. Now that the pivot's here, I'm going to use the center axis of this and the center axis here. Instead of normal, I want it to be coincident. And now I can use that offset distance, and I can pick this face and this face with the distance of 25. And that should now be centered nice and neat in between those two. Now, in this particular instance, I may want to lock this down a little bit further. Notice that it did turn orange, stating that it's fully constrained, but there's no relationship between this face and this, so there's nothing really holding it there. So if I go to placement, I can uncheck allow assumptions. And now at this point, you'll see that it has the ability to rotate this way, which it's supposed to do, but for the purposes of the assembly, I want to lock that down. So I'm going to click New Constraint, and I want to do an angle offset between this surface and this surface. And it's going to be a 0 offset. And if that's going the wrong way, you can always flip it. So now that I have that all in place, I can hit my checkbox. Now, at this point, it gets a little bit more difficult because the next two pieces I have actually go inside of the pivot, which is the two bushings, part number 4. So the two different ways I can do this is I can try to get it in here with everything the way it is, or I can left click and then right click on the U support, and I can just go to hide. If I go to hide, it removes it from the picture, but it's still over here in the tree. So when I need to, I can come back and I can unhide it. So with it hidden, I can place my next two components. So I'll go to Assemble, and I will select the bushing and open. And I want the center line of the bushing and the center line of my pivot. I don't want it to be normal. I want it to be coincident. And that's kind of going the wrong way, so I'm going to click the flip button. And it's still not really changing it. So instead of placing it on this face, I'm going to place it on this face. So now I'll zoom in and select this face and this face and change the offset to 0. So now that's in there. If I go back to Placement tab, I want to allow assumptions in this case because it's just a circular object and I need it to be fully constrained. So once I have that placed, I can go ahead and select my checkbox. I can then go back and select the bushing again and select Repeat, and it brings up my Repeat Component dialog box. Now the coincident to the axis is going to be the same. The one that's going to be different is the distance. So when I click on distance here and then add, if I click on this face now, it'll automatically place one over there, so I can say OK. So now I've got my two bushings in. I then right click back on my U support and select unhide. So now I've got everything in except for the last couple of pieces, which is part number 7, the hex bolt, and part number 8, which is the castle nut. So next I'm going to do is put in the hex bolt. So I'll go back to Assemble, hex bolt, open. And just like with everything else, I'm going to line up the center with the center. It's not normal, it's coincident. And I really need that to be going the other way, but it's not going to make that much of a difference at this point. But by clicking the flip button, it flips it back and forth. So now I can click on this face here and this face here, and then double click the distance and change it to 0. And then that puts that piece in. It's orange, so I can hit my checkbox. Now, for the last piece, which is going to be our castle nut, I'm going to put this in wrong first, just to show you an example. So when I go to Assemble, if I go to castle nut, if I just came in here and selected that curved surface and this curved surface and accidentally hit OK, the thing to notice over here is you see this little tiny square in front of the word castle nut. That lets me know that that piece is not fully constrained. Every other piece on here is fully constrained because it doesn't have this little mark. If you don't use the default placement for the first part, then every part you place is going to have that little box next to it. So rather than trying to fix that, I'm just going to right click on it and select delete and OK. And then I'm going to go back and put it in a second time. So I'll go back to Assemble, castle nut, open, and I want to grab my center point, or the axis up here and the axis here. I don't want normal, I want coincident. And that's facing the correct way, so now I can select the back face here and then the face of this here and change my distance to 0. And again, allow assumptions is perfectly fine for this particular case, just because it's a castle nut. If you wanted to lock it down a little bit further so that it could not rotate, or you wanted these notches lined up in a particular way, then you could go back in and put an angle constraint on it. But the main thing is that everything is on here and is fully constrained. Now, at this point, you've got a lot of different things going on, and it can get kind of hard to see, but if you click on this button right here, and then click or check unselect all of the reference planes and stuff go away so that you can get a much clearer picture of what we're actually working with. The assembly methods in here, they take a little bit of time and they take some practice at getting used to. But once you start to get the hang of it and you learn how the dialog box works, it can be pretty easy and it goes pretty quickly. And if you have any questions on this while you're going through and assembling it, please feel free to email me.